Everybody. Um, this essay is the development of America's two-party system. Um, so the overarching essay question is discuss the development of the American two-party system from the formation of the Constitution, 1787, to the Civil War, 1860. So, concept one. Oops. Oh, whoa. Check that out. Okay. So this is basically the time period that we're going to be looking at. Noticing here you have the Federalists in 1800 with the Democratic Republicans. This is what we were looking at in the last unit. Then we're going to move into this era, the era of good feeling from 1816 to 1824, and explain that as the Federalists kind of fall apart as a political party. And then we're going to be moving into what's known as the antebellum period, from the 1820s all the way to the 1860s, seeing the formation of the National Republican Party, the Whig, and then the modern-day Republican Party. Alongside, parallel with that, is the Democratic Party, the modern-day Democratic Party, as we have today, with Andrew Jackson. So, the first concept that we're going to be looking at here is discuss the development, discuss the formative period of the two-party system. So the two-party system is such a familiar feature in American national government that it's sometimes difficult to realize that the men who formed the Constitution did not plan for it. In fact, almost all the framers despise the idea of factions. In the Constitution, they tried to create a government that would discourage the formation of national parties. The framers of the Constitution knew that conflict between organized groups were bound to occur, as it had occurred during the drafting of the document itself. Farmers would be pitted against merchants, slaveholders against non-slaveholders, the rich against the poor. Such divisions in society were bound to lead to factions, which would struggle to gain control over state and federal governments. These struggles would bring out people's worst failings: selfishness, ambition, and deceit. So in order to gain the advantage, political parties and their leaders might stop at nothing, right? They might mobilize their supporters by appeals to fear and greed, right? And so the people's loyalties would not be to their country, but to their party, right? So this is the kind of the natural fears of the framers of the Constitution, and we see it being played out right during this day. If you turn on the news, today's election day when I'm reporting this, we'll see how it turns out, but it's quite evident that politicos in the Democratic Party and in the Republican Party definitely can be accused of putting party first. Now, they would argue, yes, putting party first is putting country first, because the people that deeply believe in these political parties would argue that what is good for the party is good for the country. The framers of the Constitution tried to create a government that would be beyond the reach of factions and different interest groups. They believed that the system of checks and balances would make it impossible for any group to gain control of the whole federal structure. For example, the president would not be a tool of a political party because he was elected by electoral college, not the people. Since federal judges were to be appointed for life, they would not depend on the party support for their offices. The selection and structure of Congress was divided to make it more difficult for a party to control it. The House of Representatives was and still is popularly elected, and they must run for re-election every 2 years. Senators are elected for 6 years, and thus more independent than members of the House. Senators were at first chosen by state legislatures until the passage of the 17th Amendment to the Constitution in 1913, which made them popularly elected. However, the very fears of the Founding Fathers had about political factions developed in the very beginning over the forming and ratification of the Constitution itself. These factions, as we all know by now, are the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The first national parties developed out of contests in Congress in the early 1790s over Hamilton's financial program. Madison and Jefferson first organized their opposition to Hamilton's programs only in Congress and did not anticipate creating a permanent popular party. But as their antagonism to Hamilton endured, and as the widely read newspapers of the day took sides between the two different interest groups and spread their political message, primitive semblances of political parties began to emerge. So, despite their best efforts, they themselves, the so-called Founding Fathers, the inspired ones, would be part and parcel of this faction, organized faction institutions called political parties. So, American political parties date their birth from the bitter clashes between Hamilton, Jefferson, and Madison over fiscal policy and foreign affairs, just like we do today, right? These factions followed sectional lines. Northern congressmen supported the Bank of the United States by a margin of 33-1, while Southern representatives opposed it to 19-6. By 1793, these sectional factions and distinct ideological identities had acquired names. Federalists representing Hamilton's views, and Democratic Republicans representing the views of both Jefferson and Madison. These ideological entities consisted of, on the left here, the Federalists, loose interpretation of the Constitution, and strong central government. Government for the rich and by the rich. New England and Atlantic Atlantic Seacoast would be prominent Federalists, so areas with nice harbors where trade and commerce was happening quite often. Federalists tend to be pro-British and anti-French. On the other hand, it's just basically a mirror opposite. Strict interpretation of the Constitution, government by the rich, but for the common man, Democratic Republicans. Strongest in the South and in the back country, pro-French and anti-British. So what the Founding Fathers failed to realize was that during the American Revolution, a fundamental transformation of the political needs of the country became clarified along distinct interests of various social groups and classes. Simultaneously, the ideology of popular sovereignty and political rhetoric during the war encouraged citizens to mobilize politically and develop high levels of expectations for their federal government's performance. Also, the freewheeling of newspapers on the various economic and social issues raised by Hamilton and Jefferson helped polarize people into one camp or the other. By 1794, both the Federalists and the Republicans had recruited supporters in each state and were preparing for the election of 1796. As president, Washington tried to stand above parties, but his pro-Hamiltonian beliefs exposed him to partisan attacks. The bitterness of party strife contributed to Washington's decision not to seek a third term in 1796, and opened the way for the first political contest for the presidency. All right, well, that's Concept 1. I'll see you in the next segment for Concept 2.